Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the ever-changing statements coming out of Boris Johnson's cabinet and when we're going to finally get unequivocal written statements of aims for trade talks with the EU. But first, if you'd like to stay notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, if we review the situation as it stands in reality, the more comprehensive the agreement we want with the EU, the closer we will have to align our standards. The less we want to align, the weaker our agreement will be. That's simple. So do we want a comprehensive agreement, or do we want a vague series of bilateral agreements that get lorries of goods across the border? Now, Boris Johnson began before the general election by saying that a comprehensive deal would not only be what he wants, but would be easy because we are already in perfect alignment with the EU. He said we're in perfect harmony. And so if you take that statement in isolation, the message was that we would also remain in alignment. Because it's obvious, really, if Boris Johnson understands that being aligned makes the deal easy, which is what he said, then he also understands that changing that alignment would be to breach the deal and it would just crumble into dust. So the problem was that he was also telling other people that he wanted us to diverge. So it didn't help anyone really know what his intentions really were. We've seen a glimpse of them since. The amendments he's made to his own withdrawal agreement, which I still have to emphasise here, he produced this withdrawal agreement that he said was amazing. So why did he need to amend it? And he amended it in a great many ways as well. But anyway, there we go, he amended it. But not only do those amendments represent breaking his promise during the general election campaign, but it also risks breaching the treaty that he's just signed with the EU if you follow them to their logical conclusion. The EU themselves are alerted to this, and they've actually warned him. What you seem to be doing may be a breach of the withdrawal agreement. Be careful. And this is why what we really need is a written statement of negotiating aims. Donald Trump had no problem publishing one last February, and if a guy who communicates exclusively using Twitter and Sharpies can do that, I see no reason why Boris Johnson, who's been preparing for this for years, couldn't have done the same. But he didn't, so we're still in the dark. There are those who still think that Boris Johnson will deliver a soft Brexit, despite everything he's saying and doing. Granted, I wouldn't pay particular attention to what he's saying other than to hold his words against him later, but his actions are also suggesting otherwise. But they insist he will just deliver a soft Brexit, maintain alignment of standards, and tell the public that it is in actual fact all different now. And it is true that the general public wouldn't notice the difference. If you tell them it's all different now, they'll go, oh, it's all different now. But those who actually want us to break from the EU would notice, and they will not go gently into that good night. And so very recently, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, said that we will completely diverge from EU standards. Now, when you consider that Javid knows how damaging Brexit is, and he's only going along with this nonsense for personal gain, you'd imagine that he wouldn't be making extreme statements unless they were required of his political masters. Unless, of course, he's simply trying to adopt the role of the frothing Brexiteer and went a bit more extreme than necessary as he tries to adopt this alien mindset. But either way, he did have to rein back on the statement a few days later, but there was still a promise to diverge in a lot of key areas. Then we've had the Brexit Secretary, Stephen Barclay, saying contradictory things to appeal to two different audiences. Common enough trick amongst dishonest politicians, say two contradictory things at the same time. On the one hand, he said that we would not diverge for the sake of diverging. Now, if you accept, therefore, that that means that if any divergence would be harmful to us, then we're not going to do it, and that you accept that almost all divergence would be bad for us, then you could just read that as them saying, well, we're going to end up with a fairly soft Brexit. There are a few areas we want to diverge from, but not a great deal. So, we just want to be free to diverge where we want. It just so happens we won't actually want to diverge in lots of areas. So those wanting a soft Brexit will look at that and go, okay, well, that means you're not going to really change much in the medium term. However, he also reiterated in the same sentence that we would not be a rule taker. Now, that, of course, is intended to appeal to the hardline Brexiteer mad dogs, but that means that we will diverge for the sake of it then. It's a bit like saying the EU says, we have this rule, we're not taking rules, so that's diverging for the sake of it. So the bottom line is we either have frictionless trade or we do not. Now, There are countries that don't have frictionless trade with the EU, of course, but they have systems in place to carry out those checks. There are countries that we don't have frictionless trade with right now. We have systems in place to do those checks. So as we get so much trade with the EU, if that's going to go from frictionless to not, we need to massively expand those systems. But we don't have those systems in place to cope with the frictionless trade. There has been no expansion of those border facilities. We're also told by those who would have to implement all this, the civil service, that there isn't time to do so. In fact, there's not even close to time to do so. We should have started this a long time ago. So, in other words, it's either frictionless trade in 2021 or chaos. Frictionless trade remaining in the EU club, whether that be by extending the transition period or signing up to a free trade agreement. Either way, joining, as with any club, means agreeing to their rules. Except we were making those rules as members, whereas now we will just be taking them without any say from now on. But when it comes to listening to ministers, we might have to see what happens in the post-Brexit reshuffle first. As things currently stand, Stephen Barclay is not going to be a minister. His department is being dissolved at the end of this week. His job as Brexit Secretary was literally to get himself sacked. But if he has influence in Cabinet, then Johnson will presumably give him another department in the reshuffle, so we will just have to see. But going back to those who think that Johnson will deliver a Brexit in name only, it's worth bearing in mind that it's not an insane conclusion to draw. It can fit with what he's been doing and saying. After all, if the government were really intent on delivering a soft Brexit, but they knew their supporters wanted a hard Brexit, and they've all made their political fortunes by arguing that black is white, then it does make sense for them to keep banging on about divergence. I suppose the concept works as follows. Keep talking about being a rule maker and not a rule taker. Then you just quietly accept all EU rules, but tell the public that we're only accepting the rules that we agree with, because it'd be madness not to accept rules that we think are good as well. And especially given that the UK voted in favour of over 97% of EU rules anyway. So we either came up with or supported the vast majority of EU rules. It's not actually difficult to make that argument. So, and again, we've seen the argument shifting so many times anyway. They're not averse to changing tack. The general public have no idea which, rules are EU ones anyway and which are UK. There are lots of rules that the average voter thinks are EU rules that either just don't exist, like straight bananas, or were actually UK legislation that the EU adopted years later because it was a good idea, like energy-saving light bulbs. But I still have to keep coming back to those who actually want divergence. I can sort of understand purely from the government's point of view how some people will think, yeah, they'll just go for a soft Brexit and say it's a hard Brexit. Because you can fool the public, that's fine. But if we end up with a soft Brexit, we don't get the US trade deal. That will be noticed. We also have to accept not only current regulations on the financial sector, but future ones as well. Well, the people who back the Conservative Party are not going to like that. And the first time Boris Johnson steps out of line, the very first time, the government's going to find itself defending itself in the European Court of Justice. That will also not go unnoticed. So there is still no clarity until we get that written document of intentions. It's supposed to be coming in early February. So I don't imagine that means in a week's time. It may mean 2 or even 3 weeks' time, but, early February has to at least mean before the 15th. When it does, I will be reviewing it for the relative proportion of firm intentions and vague unicorn-themed promises. But we'll see. Until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.